I was restocking the supply cart on the pediatric floor when my charge nurse told me I had a phone call at the front desk. It was a Tuesday in early November, and the hallway smelled like industrial disinfectant and someone's leftover Chinese takeout from the break room. I remember thinking it was strange because nobody called the hospital line anymore. Everyone texted. Everyone. I picked up the receiver and a woman's voice, professional and measured, asked if I was Ren Josephine Gallagher. I said yes. She told me she was calling from the law offices of Callahan and Pratt in Beaufort, South Carolina. She told me my great-aunt Josephine had passed away in her sleep 2 nights prior. She told me there were matters that required my presence. I stood there holding the phone with both hands and watched a little boy in a wheelchair roll past me, trailing an IV pole decorated with Spider-Man stickers, and I thought, no, not yet. Not her. I need to go back a little, because none of what happened next makes sense without understanding the shape of my family. I grew up in a subdivision outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. It was the kind of neighborhood where every house had the same 3 floor plans, and every lawn was edged on the same day by the same landscaping crew. My father, Russell, was a regional sales director for a medical device company. He wore golf polos on weekends and drank bourbon from a glass that had his initials etched into it, a gift he had bought for himself. My mother, Diane, was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and immediately calculate who in it was worth talking to. She volunteered at the country club, not at the shelter. She donated to causes that came with gallus, not to ones that came with need. They had 2 children. My brother, Colton, was 3 years older than me and had been the center of gravity in our household for as long as I could remember. He played lacrosse. He got into a mid-tier business school. He used phrases like circle back and value proposition at Thanksgiving dinner, and my parents ate it up like he was reciting Shakespeare. I was the other one, the quiet one. The one who came home from school with a stray cat and got yelled at for the smell. The one who announced at 16 that she wanted to be a nurse and watched her mother's face go still. A nurse, she said. Like I had told her I was dropping out to join a circus. My father just shook his head and went back to his laptop. The only person who ever made me feel like my choices had weight was my great-aunt Josephine. Aunt Jo. She was my grandmother's younger sister, and she had never married, never had children, and never once apologized for either of those things. She lived in Beaufort, South Carolina, in a yellow clapboard house, 3 blocks from the water, with a porch that wrapped around the front, and a backyard full of rosemary and fig trees and jasmine that bloomed so thick in the summer, you could smell it from the street. She had started a catering business when she was 26 years old. 1 kitchen, 1 van, a handwritten menu she photocopied at the library and tucked under the windshield wipers of cars parked outside of churches. Over 30 years, she turned it into Gallagher and Grace Provisions, a specialty food company that supplied restaurants, hotels, and event planners across the Lowcountry and into Savannah and Charleston. She did this without a business degree, without a partner, and without ever raising her voice above a conversational tone. She was 5'2", and she terrified people in boardrooms. My father called her eccentric, which was his word for people he could not control. My mother called her difficult, which was her word for women who did not need approval. Colton called her nothing because Colton never thought about Aunt Jo at all. I spent my summers there. Every year from the time I was 8 until I started nursing school, I took the Greyhound down to Beaufort and spent 6 weeks sleeping in her guest room with the ceiling fan that wobbled and the window that looked out over the fig trees. She taught me to make shrimp and grits the right way, low and slow, and with enough butter to make a cardiologist weep. She taught me to gut a fish without flinching, and to sew a button back on a coat, and to always tip 30%, because the people serving you are working harder than you know. She taught me that being alone is not the same thing as being lonely, and that a woman who knows her own mind is the most dangerous and most beautiful thing in the world. I visited her every month once I finished school. I was working at a hospital in Asheville by then, pulling 12-hour shifts on a pediatric unit that was chronically understaffed and perpetually underfunded. My apartment was a 1-bedroom above a Thai restaurant, and my car had 212,000 miles on it, and I was happy. Genuinely, deeply, completely happy. I loved my patients. I loved the chaos. I loved the feeling of walking into a room where a child was scared, and being the person who could make it a little less terrible. My parents did not understand this. They mentioned Colton's new promotion at every phone call. They reminded me that Colton's wife drove a Lexus. They asked me, every single time, if I was dating anyone serious, as if my romantic life was a project I was failing to deliver on time. They never asked about my patients. Not once. When Aunt Jo got sick the first time, a small stroke that left her right hand weak for a few months, my father called it nature's way of telling her to sell the business. He said this at dinner, out loud, with a bread roll in his hand. When she recovered fully and went back to work within 8 weeks, he was visibly annoyed. The funeral was in Beaufort. It was small and it was real. No receiving line. no performance. Her business partner, a man named Frank Odom, who had been with her for 22 years, stood at the podium and cried openly, and told the room that Josephine Gallagher had taught him that integrity was not a marketing strategy, it was a way of breathing. The pastor said a prayer. A woman named Beverly, who had been Aunt Jo's best friend since their 20s, sang Amazing Grace in a voice that cracked in exactly the right places. I sat in the second row and held a tissue, and felt something inside me come untethered. My father sat in the back and checked his phone twice. My mother dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief she had monogrammed for the occasion. Colton did not come. He sent a text that said, "Sorry, can't make it, work thing." He did not specify what the work thing was. 10 days later, I received a call from Henry Callahan. He asked if I could come to his office in Beaufort the following Wednesday. He said other family members had been notified, as well. I drove down on a Tuesday night and stayed at Aunt Jo's house, which still smelled like rosemary and vanilla, and the particular, dusty warmth of old books. I slept in my old guest room. The ceiling fan still wobbled. I lay there in the dark listening to it tick, and thinking about the last time I had been in this house, 3 weeks before she died. She had made us tea, and we had sat on the porch, and she had told me something I didn't fully understand at the time. She said, "Ren, I have made sure of things." I asked her what she meant. She just smiled and said, "You'll see." Henry Callahan's office was in a restored brick building on Bay Street, with tall windows and dark wood floors that creaked when you walked. My father was already there when I arrived, sitting in a leather chair with one ankle crossed over the other, projecting ease. My mother was beside him, her posture perfect, her lipstick, a shade of coral that probably had a name like Confident or Statement. They did not ask how I was. They did not ask about the drive. My father looked at me and said, "Well, this shouldn't take long." Henry was a man in his mid-60s with white hair and glasses, and the kind of calm that comes from decades of delivering news that changes people's lives. He sat behind his desk and opened a folder and began reading. There was legal language. There were references to trusts and amendments. I was watching a hummingbird outside the window, hovering near a feeder that someone had hung from the eave, and trying to keep my breathing even. Then Henry said the words, "The estate of Josephine Marie Gallagher, including all ownership interest in Gallagher and Grace Provisions, the real property located at 19 Palmetto Lane, Beaufort, South Carolina, all investment and retirement accounts, and all personal property contained therein, estimated in total value at $18.4 million, is bequeathed in its entirety to Ren Josephine Gallagher." My father's ankle uncrossed. The room was very quiet for about 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds I watched my father's face move through something I had never seen before. It was like watching weather change. Confusion. Calculation. Then a cold, focused fury that he pressed down so fast, I might have imagined it if I hadn't been looking directly at him. "There must be an error," my mother said. She said it the way she said everything, pleasantly, as if she were pointing out a wrong order at a restaurant. "There is no error," Henry said. He opened a second folder. "Josephine anticipated that this might be difficult. She asked me to share something with you." He turned his laptop around on the desk, and there she was. Aunt Jo sitting in her kitchen. The one with the yellow curtains and the cast-iron skillet hanging from the wall. She was wearing a blue cardigan, and her reading glasses were pushed up on top of her head. She looked straight into the camera the way she always looked at you, like she could see the version of you that you were trying to become, and she liked that version just fine. And she liked that version just fine. "I'm making this recording because I know my family," she said, and I just threw tears because even in a video made for after her death, she was dryly funny. "I want to be clear about why I made this decision. It's not punishment. It's not a slight. It's a recognition of truth." She paused. She took a breath. "Russell, you are my grandnephew. I've known you since you were 6 years old. I watched you grow into a man who measures people by what they can give him. I've loaned you money 4 times, you've paid me back once, and that was only because your wife found the promissory note and was embarrassed. You've called me crazy to my face and behind my back. You've told your children I was a lonely old woman who didn't know any better. I heard you say it. I was in the next room." She looked down for a moment. When she looked back up, her eyes were wet but her voice was steady. "And then there's Ren. Ren has come to see me every month for 9 years. She calls me on Thursdays because she knows Thursdays are when I miss my sister the most. She sends me pictures of her patient's artwork. She drove 4 hours in an ice storm last January to bring me soup because I had a cold. Not pneumonia, not a crisis. A cold. She didn't come because she wanted anything. She came because she is the kind of person who shows up. That is who I want carrying this forward. That is who I trust." The screen went dark. My mother was crying. Not the kind of crying that comes from grief. The kind that comes from realizing you have been outmaneuvered by a dead woman. My father stood up. He put both hands on the edge of Henry's desk and leaned forward. "I want to see the competency records," he said. His voice was quiet and sharp, and it made the hair on my arms stand up. Henry did not flinch. He opened a third folder. 2 independent psychiatric evaluations, completed within 4 months of Josephine's passing. Both confirming full mental competency, signed affidavits from her physician, her pastor, her accountant, and 3 neighbors of over 20 years, all attesting to her clarity, her consistencies, and her intent. A letter from the Beaufort County Probate Court, confirming the will had been filed, reviewed, and accepted without contest. She thought of everything, Henry said. She wanted to make sure there would be no ambiguity. My father drove to my mother's and his hotel without speaking to me. He called me that evening. He told me we needed to have a family discussion about what was responsible. He told me to come to their hotel suite at 8 o'clock. I went. Some habits take a long time to break. And the habit of wanting your parents to see you clearly is one of the last to go. When I walked in, Colton was there. He had driven up from Atlanta. He had not come to the funeral, but he had come for this. There was a folder on the coffee table. My father had already had documents prepared. A proposed trust restructuring that would split the estate into thirds, with my father serving as the managing trustee. Under this arrangement, I would receive a monthly allowance. My father would control the investments. Colton would receive a consulting fee for unspecified services. My mother sat on the sofa with her ankles crossed, watching me the way she watched salespeople she was about to negotiate with. "You're a nurse, Ren," she said. "You work 12-hour shifts. You don't have time to manage this. We're trying to help you." Colton leaned forward. He was wearing a Patagonia vest and a watch that cost more than my car. "Think about it logically," he said. "You don't know anything about running a company. You'd be in over your head in a week." My father was standing by the window, arms crossed, silhouette dark against the city lights. He didn't say anything. He was letting them do the work. I looked at the documents. I thought about Aunt Jo sitting in her kitchen, looking into the camera with those clear, unblinking eyes. I thought about what she had said. "That is who I trust." "No," I said. Colton laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound, the kind of laugh that is designed to make you feel small. "You can't be serious." "No," I said again. "This is what she wanted. I'm honoring it." My father turned from the window. "Then you're on your own," he said. He said it simply, the way you state a fact. No holidays, no calls, no family. You walk out that door and you're a stranger. I looked at him. I wanted to say something that would make him understand. I wanted to find the words that would unlock whatever door he had closed between us years ago. But I looked at his face and I saw that there was no door. There had never been a door. There was just a wall, and I had spent my entire life knocking on it. I picked up my bag and I left. I drove to Beaufort that night. 3 hours in the dark on I-26, the radio off, my hands steady on the wheel. I pulled into Aunt Jo's driveway just after midnight. The porch light was on. She had it on a timer, and I realized she had never turned it off. It had been on every night since she died, waiting. I sat on the porch steps and called my friend Margot, another nurse from my unit. She answered on the second ring, even though it was past midnight, because that is the kind of person she is. I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time and then she said, "Ren, do you remember what you always tell the parents in the PICU? You say, you don't have to have all the answers right now. You just have to stay in the room. Stay in the room, Ren." I went inside. I slept in my old bed under the quilt. Aunt Jo had sewn from fabric scraps she had collected over 40 years, pieces of old aprons and dish towels, and a square from the tablecloth she had used at her very first catering job. In the morning, Henry Callahan was on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and a bag of biscuits from the bakery on Carteret Street. "I tried your phone," he said. "When you didn't answer, I figured you'd be here." We sat at the kitchen table, the one where I had shelled peas and rolled dough, and done homework and cried and laughed and been seen. And Henry began to show me what Aunt Jo had left behind. Not just the money, the architecture. First, there were the financial records, detailed, meticulous spreadsheets in her handwriting, later transferred to digital files by her accountant, documenting every loan she had ever made to my father. 4 loans over 12 years, totaling $387,000. 1 partial repayment of $42,000. The remaining $345,000 was outstanding, with signed promissory notes for each one. Henry explained that under the terms of the estate, these debts were now owed to me as the sole beneficiary. My father had signed legal documents acknowledging each loan. They were enforceable. Then Henry showed me the security footage. Aunt Jo had installed a camera system in her house 14 months before she died. She told Henry it was for safety. What it captured was my mother. 3 days after the funeral, while I was back in Asheville packing for the will reading, my mother had driven to Beaufort, alone. The footage showed her letting herself in through the side door with a key she must have copied at some point. She moved through the house quickly, going straight to the bedroom closet. She knew exactly where to look. She pulled a carved wooden jewelry box from the top shelf and opened it on the bed. She removed a strand of pearls that had belonged to Aunt Jo's mother. She removed a sapphire ring that Aunt Jo had bought herself on her 50th birthday. The day Gallagher and Grace hit its first million in annual revenue. She removed a gold charm bracelet with 14 charms, each one representing a milestone in the business. She put them in her purse. She smoothed the bedspread. She left. I watched this footage sitting at the kitchen table with my hands flat on the wood surface, and my jaw so tight, my teeth hurt. Henry let me sit with it. Then he said, Josephine anticipated this possibility. These items are documented in the estate inventory, with photographs and independent appraisals. Their combined value is approximately $94,000. You have the right to file a police report and pursue criminal charges for theft of estate property. I asked him if there was another option. He said we could demand return of the items with a formal letter, making clear that the security footage existed, and that failure to return the property within 14 days would result in both criminal referral and a civil suit. I chose the letter. The items were returned by courier within 6 days. My mother did not include a note. Over the following weeks, things moved. The people Aunt Jo had trusted began to appear, one by one, like they had been waiting for a signal. Frank Odom, her business partner, sat with me for 3 full days going through the operations of Gallagher and Grace. He was patient and thorough, and he cried exactly once when he opened a drawer in her office and found a note she had left him. It said, Frank, teach her the way I taught you. Start with the kitchen. Beverly came every morning with breakfast and stories. She told me about the year Aunt Jo almost lost the business when a supplier went bankrupt, and she drove to 6 different farms in one day to source replacements. She told me about the time Aunt Jo catered a wedding for 300 people, and the oven broke an hour before service, and she cooked the entire main course on outdoor grills. She borrowed from 4 neighbors. She told me that Aunt Jo had been talking about me for years, that she had said, Beverly, that girl is the one. She's not loud about it. She doesn't need to be. A man named Garrett, who lived 2 houses down, and had been a county sheriff's deputy for 21 years before retiring, stopped by on the 3rd morning. He said, Jo told me to keep an eye on this place once she was gone. I told her I would. He sat on the porch with his coffee and a calm, steady presence that made the house feel safer. He was a few years older than me, broad-shouldered and quiet, and he had the kind of face that looked like it had heard a lot of hard stories and chosen kindness anyway. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and eventually I stopped, pretending I didn't look forward to seeing his truck pull into the drive. When my father, mother, and brother arrived the following Saturday, they did not call ahead. They pulled into the driveway at 9 in the morning, expecting to find me alone and overwhelmed. What they found was a kitchen table, with 6 people sitting around it. Frank with the operational files spread out in front of him. Beverly with a fresh pot of coffee. Henry with his briefcase open. Garrett standing by the counter with his arms folded. Still wearing his badge out of habit, even though he had been retired for 3 years. And a woman named Judge Adeline Marsh, who had been Aunt Jo's college roommate at the College of Charleston 50 years ago, and who had driven from Columbia, specifically because Aunt Jo had asked her to, in a letter written 6 months before she died. My father stopped in the doorway. His eyes moved across the table. I could see him recalculating. This is a private family matter, he said. Henry stood up. Actually, Mr. Gallagher, several of the matters we need to discuss today are legal in nature. He placed 3 documents on the table. The first is a formal demand for repayment of $345,000 in outstanding, personal loans, documented with signed promissory notes. The second is a notice that the estate has recovered all jewelry items removed from this property without authorization, and that we have preserved security footage documenting the removal for potential future proceedings. The third is a cease and desist letter regarding any further attempts to contest the will or pressure the beneficiary into altering the terms of the estate. My father's face was very still. My mother sat down in the nearest chair, like someone had cut her strings. Colton, who had walked in behind them with his phone in his hand, put it away for the first time in possibly his entire adult life. Judge Marsh spoke. Her voice was calm and precise, and carried the weight of someone who had spent 40 years on the bench. Josephine was one of the finest people I have ever known. She spent the last 2 years of her life making sure this transition would go smoothly. I am here as a witness, not as a judge. But I want you to understand that every document in this room has been reviewed, filed, and certified. There is no angle here. There is no gap. She built this to be airtight, because she knew exactly who she was dealing with. I looked at my father. He was standing in the same doorway where I had stood 1,000 times as a child, waiting to be noticed. I used to shrink in that doorway. I used to make myself smaller, hoping that being small enough would make me safe enough to be loved. I am not going to describe myself as brave. I don't think bravery is the right word for what happened next. I think the right word is clarity. You spent my whole life telling me I wasn't enough, I said. My voice was even. My hands were steady. You told me being a nurse was beneath us. You told me my choices were embarrassing. You never came to visit me. You never asked about my patients. You never asked about my life. But Aunt Jo did. She asked about all of it. She remembered my patients' names. She sent cards to the ones who were in the hospital for a long time. She showed up for me in every way you refused to. And she did it quietly, without keeping score. Because that is what love looks like when it's real. I took a breath. She didn't leave me this because I earned it. She left me this because she trusted me to do what she would have done. And that is exactly what I am going to do. My father opened his mouth. He closed it again. He looked at the table full of people, at the documents, at the footage he knew existed, at the judge who was watching him with calm, immovable eyes. He turned and walked out. My mother followed. At the door she paused. She turned back and looked at me, and for one moment, one single moment, I saw something in her face that might have been recognition. Not remorse, not yet, but the beginning of understanding that she had lost something that could not be recovered with a letter, or a phone call, or a monogrammed handkerchief. Colton left without a word. His car was the first to pull out of the drive-him. Within 60 days my father repaid the full $345,000 in outstanding loans. Henry told me later that my father's attorney had advised him to settle quickly and quietly, because the promissory notes were ironclad. And any attempt to dispute them would result in the loans becoming a matter of public record, which would be professionally humiliating for a man who had spent his career projecting financial success. The months that followed was the heart of the and most important of my life. I took a leave of absence from the hospital. Frank taught me the business from the ground up, starting, as Aunt Jo had instructed, in the kitchen. I learned to wake up at 4 a.m. to receive deliveries. I learned the names of every driver, every prep cook, every dishwasher. I learned that Aunt Jo had paid above market rate for every position in the company, because she believed that people who feel valued do better work, and she had been right. I found in a filing cabinet in her home office a folder labeled "For Ren, when she's ready." Inside was a business plan for a foundation, the Josephine Gallagher Community Table. Her vision was specific and practical, exactly like her. Free cooking classes for low-income families in the Low Country, a weekend meal program for elderly residents living alone, scholarships for culinary students from rural communities, and a dedicated fund to provide school cafeterias in underserved districts with fresh, locally sourced ingredients. I put $4 million into it in the first year. I hired Beverly to run the meal program, because she had been feeding people her entire life, and she was the best person for the job. I went back to nursing. I want to be clear about that. I requested a transfer to Beaufort Memorial Hospital and I went back to work. 3 12-hour shifts a week. Pediatrics. I did not stop being a nurse because I had money. The money changed what I could do, but it did not change who I was. When a kid on my unit needed a wheelchair that insurance wouldn't cover, I could make a call. When a single mom was sleeping in the waiting room because she couldn't afford gas to drive home and come back, I could help. I did these things quietly, the way Aunt Jo would have. I live in her house now. The porch light still comes on every evening at dusk. The fig trees in the backyard are heavy with fruit every August, and I make preserves the way she taught me, with too much sugar and not enough patience, and they turn out fine. The rosemary by the back fence has grown into a hedge so thick and fragrant that people slow down on the sidewalk when they walk past. Garrett fixed the wobble in the ceiling fan. He also fixed the screen door, and the leaky faucet in the bathroom, and a cracked board on the porch steps. He comes for dinner most nights now. We are something. I don't have a word for it yet, and neither does he, and neither of us is in a hurry to find one. On Sundays the kitchen table is full. Frank and his wife, Beverly, Henry, who has become something between an advisor and an uncle, 2 nurses from my unit, Garrett, usually quiet, usually the last to leave, a rotating, messy, imperfect gathering of people who loved the same woman I loved, and who chose to stay. These dinners are nothing like the ones I grew up with. Nobody is performing. Nobody is calculating. We argue about barbecue and college football, and whether Beverly's cornbread is better than Aunt Jo's, which it is not, and Beverly knows it, and she makes it anyway. Last month, I got a letter from my mother. It was short. It said, "I have been thinking about Thursdays." I stared at it for a long time. Aunt Jo had told her, in that video, that I called every Thursday because Thursdays were hardest. My mother had heard that. She had remembered it. I don't know what that means yet. I don't know if it means anything at all, but I put the letter in the wooden box on the top shelf of the closet, next to the pearls and the sapphire ring and the charm bracelet, and I thought, maybe someday. This is what Aunt Jo left me. Not $18 million. She left me the proof that a life lived with generosity compounds over time. The way interest does. Except it compounds in people instead of accounts. Every fair deal she made, every cook she trained, every neighbor she fed without being asked, every quiet act of decency she performed when nobody was watching, it came back. Not to her. She never needed it to. It came back to me, in the form of a room full of people who loved her, and who stood up when it mattered, and who keep showing up every Sunday, because that is what she taught us to do. If you have ever felt invisible in your own family, If you have ever been the child who was always in the room, but never in the conversation, I want you to know something. The people who see you are out there. Sometimes they are not the ones who were supposed to love you. Sometimes they are an aunt who lives in a yellow house by the water and teaches you to make biscuits and looks at you like you are already the person you are trying to become. And sometimes the people who were supposed to show up for you show you exactly who they are. And the most important thing you can do is believe them the first time. Stop knocking on walls. Go find the people who leave the porch light on. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment and tell me about the person who saw you when no one else did. I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, tap that button. There's more coming.